When making focaccia, it's common to not add the flavourings into the dough and to just put them on top. This might be more traditional, but I think adding the ingredients into the dough is worth experimenting with, as it makes for a much more flavourful bread. Something that I really like about focaccia is that it works really well with lots of different flavour combinations. I'm going to be doing 2 breads, one with sun-dried tomatoes and the other olives. Both breads are vegan and will make 16 pieces each. The basis of this dough is very simple. Just flour, yeast, water and a tiny bit of sugar. So first I weighed out the yeast. I used 7 grams, which is the same as you get in those little sachets, and 2 teaspoons of caster sugar. It's important for the yeast that you use lukewarm water. Too hot and you will kill the yeast, and not hot enough, then it won't activate properly. It should feel like body temperature, so when you put a finger in, you don't notice a change in temperature. I find the easiest way to do this is to have a jug of cold water and add little bits of hot water from the kettle until the temperature is right. Then I combined the water and yeast to make sure that it's still alive. I gave it a little stir to get it going. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes and will froth up like this. If it doesn't, then the yeast is dead. Whilst that's going, I can weigh out the flour. I use 500 grams of white bread flour for the sun-dried tomato bread and whole wheat for the olive one. It's important to use bread or strong flour and not plain flour when making bread, because bread flour contains more protein than plain flour. When the flour is mixed with water, the protein forms gluten, and this gluten is what traps the gas bubbles, which gives rise to the texture of the bread. I want the focaccia I'm making to be crisp, so I'll need to add oil at several stages. It makes sense to use olive oil for the olive bread, but with the sun-dried tomato bread, I can use the oil from the jar of the tomatoes, as this will add to the tomato flavour of the dough and save on wastage. At this stage, I need 50 grams to go into the dough. To combine the yeast and flour, I made a hole in the middle of the flour pile and spread it out so it looks like the top of a volcano. I kept the bowl and added a drizzle of oil to it. This will save me later, so I don't have to do it when my hands are doughy. You can do this in a bowl if you don't want to make so much mess. I personally prefer doing it this way, as I find having the extra space makes the dough easier to work with, and it gives you the option of holding back some flour if it turns out you don't need it all. I also think it's helpful to have a bag of flour lying down with a spoon in it so I can easily add more with my doughy hands. Then I poured in the yeast mixture and gave it a mix with my fingers in a claw shape, adding more flour as I go. Once the mixture is thick enough that I'm not worried it's going to spill over the edges, I combined most of the rest of the flour and started kneading. You may need more or less flour or water than I do, as every dough is different. I've found having the dough wet enough that it slightly sticks to my finger when I poke it gives me the best results. As soon as I'm happy the dough is smooth enough, I shaped it in my hand so that it's an even shape and then popped it into the oiled bowl. I then used the dough to spread the oil around the bowl and coat the dough. This stops it from sticking once it's grown. It's important to cover the dough to stop it from drying out, so I popped a damp tea towel over the top. The other thing the dough needs when improving is a warm environment. My kitchen often gets rather cold, and the first time I tried to film this recipe, the dough barely rose. So my solution is to put some pans of boiling water either side of it. This did the trick nicely. Let it rise until it doubled in size, which took mine about an hour. You can test it by gently poking it and it shouldn't spring back up. Whilst the dough was rising, I could prep the veg that's going to flavour the bread. First, the basil needs a quick wash, then today I decided to finely slice it so that it was more visible in the bread, as the green of the basil goes nicely with the red of the tomatoes. I used 100 grams of the tomatoes and finely chopped them by cutting them into thin strips, lining the strips up and then cutting across them. Once I've done that, I still wanted them a little smaller, so just roughly chopped them a little more. I used about half a large bulb of garlic. If you have a smaller bulb, I'd recommend using a whole one. I crushed them with my garlic press thingy. I much prefer it to a normal garlic crusher because it's so much easier to clean, and when doing more than a few cloves of garlic, I think it's quicker too. Although often I will chop garlic because I do think it's fun. Once it's finely chopped, I want to smush it almost into a paste, so I sprinkled a little salt on the pile of garlic. Then holding the back of a knife, I pushed it down between the blade and the board and scraped it towards me. The salt draws out the moisture and acts as an abrasive, which makes it easier to smush. And unlike the basil, I don't want to see little pieces of garlic everywhere. I want to flavour the bread consistently with garlic rather than have little pockets of garlickiness. You could instead blitz with basil, garlic and tomatoes in a food processor. For the olive bread, I'm adding lemon zest, thyme, olives and garlic. Once I've zested the lemon, I chopped the zest up a little bit to get it finer, as the strips from the grater were quite big. You could use dried thyme, but I'm using fresh thyme here. The leaves need taking off the sprigs, and then finely chopping. I used about a handful of olives out of the jar and chopped them into little strips. Chopping the olives smaller than this makes the bread too homogeneous for my liking, but you do you. To cut them into strips, I halved them and sliced them across for halves. My garlic cloves were enormous, so I only needed 4, but if your garlic is a more normal size, I'd use about 10 cloves, but it depends how garlicky you want your bread, of course. Once I'd cut them into a more reasonable size, then I smooshed the garlic in the same way as with the tomato bread. The dough has risen enough now, so I took it out of the bowl to add the veg. I need to combine the veg with the dough and also knock it back. Knocking back is when you knock the air out of the dough after it's proofed. This is normally to stop uneven air holes in the bread, but with focaccia, these irregularities are what we're after, so it only needs lightly knocking back. I put a bit of flour on the work surface and my hands to stop things sticking. Then to add the veg, I want the dough to have enough space to put the veg on top, and just knead them into the dough. The veg was quite wet, which made the dough stickier, so as I kneaded them, I needed to add quite a bit more flour. As soon as the veg is fully incorporated, then it's ready. I oiled the baking trays with the respective oils to stop the dough from sticking, then placed the dough on and pushed it to the shape of a tray, then left it to rise again until it doubled in size, which took an hour. Before going into the oven, I covered the dough with a layer of brine. This adds even more flavour to the dough and makes it crispier. I combined oil and water in a ratio of 2:1 and added a pinch of salt. Once it's risen again, I can do what is undoubtedly the most satisfying part of the process. Poke, 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 poke. I'm dipping my fingers into some water to stop them from sticking to the dough. Doing this is useful because it helps keep the focaccia flat, and also the dimples hold the brine coating and help it soak into the dough. Into the oven it goes for 15 to 20 minutes at 200 degrees C or 390 degrees Fahrenheit. When it's golden brown, it's ready to come out of the oven. It should be fine to lift straight out of the baking tray with a fish slice. Finish the bread by brushing oil on top. You can eat the bread whilst warm, but if you do, you might find it disintegrates slightly when you cut it and turns doughy, so I like to leave it to cool before slicing mine. The focaccia will keep for 3 to 4 days in an airtight container, although I think it's hard to stop it from drying out a little bit after the first 2 days, at which point I think it works best as a side to other dishes. But if you do want to have some on its own, or with some butter, I pop it in the microwave for 15 seconds or so, which warms and softens it up again.